On a humid spring evening in 1921, a young black teenager stepped into an elevator in downtown Tulsa, and within hours, a rumor would ignite one of the most devastating acts of racial violence in American history. A catastrophe so immense that for decades it was buried in silence, as if an entire city had agreed to forget what it had done. The city was Tulsa, and by 1921 it was booming, oil money pouring in, skyscrapers rising, fortunes being made overnight. But beneath that prosperity lay a rigid and deeply enforced system of segregation. Across the railroad tracks, separated both physically and socially, stood Greenwood District, known across the country as Black Wall Street. It was a place of remarkable achievement, a thriving community where black entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers, and business owners had built wealth and independence in defiance of the racial limitations imposed by the era. Greenwood wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a statement. More than 10,000 residents lived there. There were hotels, movie theaters, newspapers, and over 600 black-owned businesses. Men in tailored suits walked past women in elegant dresses. Children attended well-funded schools. The district symbolized what was possible, even in a nation still deeply divided. But success, in that time and place, came with danger. On May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered the Drexel building to use a restroom located on the top floor. The elevator was operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. What happened inside that elevator remains unclear. Accounts vary, and no definitive truth was ever established. Some believed Rowland may have tripped and grabbed Page to steady himself. Others speculated something more sinister. But what mattered wasn't what actually happened, it was what people believed happened. The next morning, a local newspaper ran a sensational headline suggesting an attempted assault. The story spread rapidly. By afternoon, a white mob had gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. The atmosphere thickened with tension. Lynching was not uncommon in America at the time, and many feared that Rowland would not survive the night. Word reached Greenwood quickly. A group of armed black men, many of them World War I veterans, decided they would not allow another lynching. They marched to the courthouse, offering to help protect Rowland. The sheriff declined, but the mere presence of armed black men enraged the white crowd. A confrontation followed. A single gunshot rang out. And then everything exploded. Within hours, Tulsa descended into chaos. White mobs surged toward Greenwood, looting homes, setting fire to businesses, and shooting residents in the streets. The violence was not random, it was systematic. Airplanes were reportedly seen flying overhead, dropping incendiary devices. Entire blocks were reduced to ash. Families fled for their lives, carrying only what they could hold. By dawn, Greenwood was in ruins. Over 35 square blocks had been destroyed. More than 1,200 homes were burned. Churches, schools, hospitals, gone. The death toll remains uncertain, but historians estimate that as many as 300 people may have been killed. Thousands were left homeless, forced into internment camps under armed guard. The scale of destruction was staggering, and yet what followed was perhaps even more shocking. Silence. There were no serious prosecutions. Insurance claims were denied. Records disappeared. The event was quietly erased from textbooks, from public discourse, from collective memory. Survivors were left to rebuild on their own, without compensation or acknowledgement. For decades, the massacre was rarely spoken of, even in Tulsa itself. But memory has a way of resurfacing. In the late 20th century, historians and survivors began pushing for recognition. Investigations were launched, mass graves were searched, stories that had been whispered in private finally reached the public. The truth, long buried, began to emerge. Greenwood remarkably rebuilt. Brick by brick, business by business, the community rose again, though it would never fully regain its former prosperity. Urban renewal projects in the mid-20th century would later disrupt the area once more, carving highways through what remained of the historic district. Still, the legacy endured. The story of Tulsa is not just about destruction, it is about resilience, injustice, and the cost of silence. It forces a nation to confront uncomfortable truths about its past, to recognize the lives lost not only to violence, but to forgetting. Today, the events of 1921 are finally being taught, discussed, and acknowledged. Memorials stand where ashes once lay. Descendants of survivors continue to seek justice, demanding not only remembrance, but accountability. And it all began with a moment in an elevator, a fleeting, uncertain interaction that spiraled into one of the darkest chapters in American history. Because sometimes history doesn't just happen. Sometimes it is allowed to happen.